welcome to Brown Bag, a podcast series looking at the interconnections between media, social media in particular, democracy, politics, and technology from a Global South perspective. My name is Hattotuwa, and I am a special advisor at the ICT for Peace Foundation.
There are two Western gazes, right? There is the Western gaze that looks upon what impacts them, what impacts their population. And then there's the Western gaze that looks at other markets. So it isn't that these companies are not looking at South Asia, they are, but they're looking at it from profit. The populace that would like to live in a dark room and issue edicts and, have people, their citizens, completely fall in line with their edicts no longer occurs because people start talking and things come about. So therefore, that is perhaps our biggest tool as well on human rights.
Hello and welcome to this podcast. I'm speaking with Meenakshi Ganguli, the South Asian Director of Human Rights Watch. Meenakshi, thanks for joining me on this podcast, as I understand it, on your sabbatical.
Thank you so much, Sanjana. Yes, I'm enjoying my sabbatical tremendously.
I think many of us would be quite envious, given that we are faced with what we are in Sri Lanka and in India and many other parts of South Asia, and we don't seem to be able to catch a break. So, good on you for taking a holiday in the middle of all that is going on and wrong.
Well, I did have to come out of sabbatical when trouble started in Sri Lanka, only because, there was briefings that we had to do to try and make sure that protests remained peaceful and the security forces didn't go a bit crazy in trying to curb these protests. So,
not entirely sure how successful you've been in that regard, but
our conversations are only with diplomats. And considering right now Sri Lanka is looking for financial support, one would hope at this point, at least the government will be a little bit more cautious about how they treat people who are really suffering because of poor economic decisions.
My understanding is that what you and I think is of no consequence or little consequence to how things pan out. But that may be a wider or larger parable. Listen, I really appreciate you joining. As I think I told you before we started, my interest in the podcast was driven by, not solely, but largely by what's happened in, say, the past 2 years in the course of the pandemic to our region. Yeah. And given that this is focused on technology, so much has also happened in the world of social media, and a lot of it, including revelations of Haugen. We can talk about what's come out more recently with regards to India. A lot of it seems to be, as I think you'll agree with me, from a Western gaze. Mm-hmm. Not least because it's been reported in the global north and in the west, but also because it seems to be linked to this idea that the Silicon Valley and social media companies really have their largest user bases in America, which is quite wrong. It is India that I think is the harbinger and prefaces so much of what the rest of the world countenances. So I wanted to talk about some of those issues and place South Asia front and center. And who better than you? Now, let's start with the confession that I made before I started as well. I said I was so involved and engaged and tired by Sri Lanka, and then secondarily keeping up with India as well, that I really don't know what's happening in our region.
Yeah.
So, Meenakshi, if you were to be asked, it's a simple question, but I suppose a very hard answer. What, to your mind, have been some of the significant changes in South Asia as a consequence of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier, which is the Western gaze. And I want to talk about that only because there are two Western gazes, right? There is the Western gaze that looks upon what impacts them, what impacts their population. And then there's the Western gaze that looks at other markets. So it isn't that these companies are not looking at South Asia. They are, but they're looking at it from profit. They're looking at it as a business thing. They're not looking at it as an impact conversation. And the reason I'm saying that is because right now there's all these inquiries going on after the after the US elections and the Trump supporters that acted up in DC. And there is conversation there about social media and what might have, but we have not seen that similar kind of hard look really at what happened in our part of the world, in the South Asian context. So just wanted to flag that. Now to go back to your question, if we look from Afghanistan to Myanmar, right? So we look from west to east. We have a massive refugee crisis. Afghanistan, for all the policies, again, of the West and the sort of hurried departure that occurred, led by the US, we've had a unprecedented refugee crisis. People desperate to leave, planes stopped, not being able to leave, and people who had believed somewhat in the democratic process, who were now at risk as the Taliban entered the capital. And on the other side is Myanmar, where, of course, since 2017 and even prior, we've had the Rohingya sort of stuck in limbo, waiting to go back home. So, in fact, South Asia is kind of bracketed by these two sort of refugee crises. Then, of course, there is the middle, and what has happened in South Asia in recent times. And we've had, in Nepal, of course, a number of governments have come and gone in through this process, and right now Nepal politics is interesting because the alliances keep shifting. So enemies of yesterday become friends of today, but unfortunately, the policies in terms of human rights has not always been up and center. But the reason I raised Nepal first is because Nepal, the war ended in 1996, and since then there has been this effort at transitional justice for the conflict and the abuses that occurred during the conflict, and that's relevant because Sri Lanka, the war ended in 2009, and again repeatedly we are being told that there will be transitional justice. It can be a domestic mechanism, and going by Nepal's experience, we can kind of assume that it will not occur in Sri Lanka as well. So the other part of this is the internal conflicts that occur in South Asia. In terms of governance, the other thing is that, again, there is the challenge of, I'm just sort of shrinking myself into India. So again, going from west to east, Pakistan has had massive political protests. But because Pakistan has a military that kind of almost holds the reins to almost anything that is decided. In the end, Imran Khan's government was toppled, largely because I think it lost favor with the military. Bangladesh side, again, the government has used the military. It's the reverse, where the government does hold power, but is using the military in the most awful ways. And therefore, most recently, the US has announced sanctions on a rapid action battalion, which has been responsible for extrajudicial killings and disappearances. And then if you come middle to India, we are seeing India as facing enormous challenges. These are not challenges that have come back, have existed since 1947. This level of public sort of despair over religious divide has, it's like a revisiting this level of public hate, and unfortunately, almost entirely to be blamed upon the ruling BJP, because what they've done is use religious divide to try and win votes, and eventually they lose control of this because the narrative shifts. And to go back to your interest, all of these narratives shift because of what plays out on social media and WhatsApp and such like. So there we are. It's a region not very, very, very. It really is quite bleak. And there's so much that we can pick up on it. But just a personal story. I mean, when Afghanistan, the proverbial excrement hit the
hit the ceiling fan. I'm suppose many of us were called upon to assist with how, in my case, it was how social media companies should respond.
Right.
And it's deja vu, right? It's happened with Myanmar. This happened again after Afghanistan with the Ukraine.
Yes.
And it does, I'm at a loss for words, Meenakshi, around the degree to which I now believe the ability of these companies to absorb lessons and respond in a meaningful manner, notwithstanding the magnitude of the challenges that they are confronted with on the ground. What was it like you as HRW to kind of respond to Afghanistan, Myanmar, the challenges of India, now Sri Lanka? Have you seen any leitmotifs in that regard where you're called upon to respond to much the same things year after year with no discernible, at least to you, uptake on lessons that should have been learned?
Well, I don't know if there are what we mean by lessons to be learned, right? What lesson do we want to learn? If you speak in terms of the companies themselves, their lessons are largely profit. Are they being able to enter markets where they are finding more subscribers and more users? That is their level of success. Any executive would tell you that. That's their measure. In that case, they're succeeding. And not to sort of forget the fact that South Asia, communication, information, and the ability to learn new things has been enabled to a large part by these sort of platforms. And we know that there is the connection that technology in a way has enabled a lot of good. And we should acknowledge that, because there are literacy levels are very low. Certainly the penetration level of governance is very low in large parts of South Asia. So the ability for people to communicate has been much better. I mean, one example, for instance, is the flooding that we're witnessing right now in Assam and northern Bangladesh, and you find that people are able to communicate when there are risks. So all of those are good things. But was it good that drove these platforms? Perhaps not, right? Good emerges. So I think that's where the challenge lies, doesn't it? The challenge lies in intent. And the intent was not necessarily good. Was, by the way, what they wanted was customers. So therefore, I'm saying that what is the motivation is also.
They would like us to believe that good was center and forward. I mean, there's all these the for good. Is always an appendage to the companies. You have Facebook for good, Twitter for good. All these good initiatives, and they would have you believe that that's what they were interested in. Listen, I have a personal anecdote. I mean, to kind of counter what you just said, though I do agree with it. This is just to kind of play the devil's advocate. I was in Kabul before everything went pear-shaped, and there was a gardener. And he was addicted to, at the time, a very sophisticated, fairly high-end Samsung phone. And I was curious because I didn't speak Pashto. So I took my translator and went up to him and I spoke to him. I said, first, how did you get this phone? And then two, I saw him, he was on Facebook and he was completely literate. I said, what are you doing on Facebook? So it turns out that his grandchildren and children have pooled together to get him a birthday gift, and that was the phone. And he was completely illiterate. So all he did was he had been taught how to like photos.
Right.
And that's all he did, aside from prayers and the Quran, which was an audio app that, at prayer time, said what the prayer time was, and then also afforded him verses of the Quran. But then I kind of talked to my translator. I said, listen, can you explain to me how this works? Because, there were some apps that were quite curious. And he said, basically what the Taliban did was when you took a phone to get it recharged, in the sense of put money to it, they used to put apps that No, I mean, it's quite interesting, right? So they used to put apps that the end user thought was Google. So when the app was basically promoting Taliban propaganda, I kept encountering in the workshops and the conversations that I had that Google was telling me this. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So they thought, because of that interesting transaction that you would never know until and unless you were part of that, that you went on the ground and figured that out. They thought that it was Google that was selling this. And, when I mentioned these to the companies, they have no clue, And that brings me to the broader point, with Corona Jihad, in early 2020 in India, we had comparable things that, these are very serious things. The companies didn't have Bangla, I think till 2020, Facebook didn't have, and so that, moderation and classifiers didn't exist for major Indian languages till as recently as a couple of years ago. So, I mean, I don't know whether you share my go from anxiety to frustration to resignation that the companies with their largest markets that reside in South Asia still don't value us enough to give, to make the investments to keep their customers safe. It boggles my mind, Meenakshi.
Well, again, who are their customers? Who will, if they are intermediaries, who do they have to keep most happy? So no, let's not. Yes, I would actually like to believe that all things being equal, they would like to keep their customers safe and would like them to be informed and would like their platform to be a sort of free space for exchange. But that isn't how it works, right? Because what has happened is that these platforms have been harnessed to convey messaging. And of course, all of us use it. All of us use this to convey our particular messaging, except that political forces clearly have much more capacity to do so. So, in India, we've discovered many sort of little apps and so on that have been used to, for instance, trend or make viral a particular message, or the capacity to sort of, use influencers to promote a particular message. That's because they have the resources. So it's not a level playing field. Now, if it's not a level playing field in which there is the likelihood of hate campaigns and such like being promoted by vested interests who are more powerful, then concern becomes if they are the client. And I think what you were referring to earlier about India is that that's what had happened, right? Who did Facebook treat as their client? And it wasn't the end user. It wasn't you and I and our little Facebook accounts with our 1,500 friends. It wasn't, right? It was these big companies that were using this for their own purposes. And if that message was not something that met their social conscience standards, they still held back because the market is too big, which goes back to my initial problem about the gaze. How do they gaze? And the gaze, unfortunately, is profit and market.
Well, it's not just the companies, is it? It's also a political party in India, just as it was a family in Sri Lanka. And so, and just as it was, a political party in the United States. So, I mean, again, we can talk about this a bit more. But, listen, what I do now is to look at the manner in which toxic, I call it a digital Novichok. A Novichok meaning, it's the poison, but this poison is digital and you can't also literally see it. It poisons society from within. And I really peg Sri Lanka's cataclysmic, catastrophic collapse to what I have been studying for well over a decade in how propaganda, myths and disinformation and information disorders were instrumentalized by the ruling family, the Rajapaksas, to their gain, to their benefit, and to the country's net loss. How has disinformation in particular, but also the region's tryst, to use a Nehruvian phrase, not in the way that he intended it ever, I think, with information disorders impacted, Meenakshi, what you do, what HRW does, what you're interested in, which is rights and governance, particularly, by the way, again, I mean, focusing on the pandemic years, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's really got bad in these 2 years.
Well, the one thing that happened in the pandemic years is because, of course, it brought in the lockdown. And what happened with the lockdown is people therefore got stuck to their devices because everything was happening over devices, including conversations you and I have had. And therefore, more devices meant more access to this kind of information and so on. So therefore, there was a ready market. Now, that's what I'm saying, that you see, there is a ready market of consumer. Then what do you do with that market? So during the pandemic, I think people began to recognize that, like we found, for instance, even data security, the apps that were being used for students to study were collecting information about children. The fact that governments recognized that there was, or advertisers recognized really, that there were much more children online because they were by their very nature, on Zoom classes and such like, was that they started targeting those markets. So what I'm saying is that, yes, the pandemic brought many more people online because they had to. But as soon as you do that, there are all these other things that come in, much more. I mean, look at the ready market. Look at the amount of information that has been collected, amount of data that has been collected. This, if you're talking about South Asia, that's like 1.5 billion people. That level of information is now available. That market is available. So was it also used badly? Now, I want to go back a little bit to the political narratives, particularly, I would say, in India and Sri Lanka, where there is this sort of very populist embrace of the political narrative. We are your saviors, we are the strong people, we will protect you and such like, which is both the BJP and SLPP or whatever the Rajapaksa.
Yeah, the Rajapaksas. Yeah.
So now, and both have used this, and to both, they used it to great effect, right? They've used it to the point where, don't keep fussing about justice. We want development. Don't keep fussing about, these minorities. They are problematic. And don't you say that? That became part of the public discourse, right? It became part of what people were saying. I mean, today, just before I'm joining your call, I was reading about Kashmiri students who can't be given, can't get apartments on rent in Delhi because they're Kashmiri Muslim. And, that is a sort of partly fear. Oh my God, at which point will the state come and, sort of conduct a raid and then my house gets locked up? Partly it is just plain bigotry. And that conversation about, no, Muslims are bad. Now, this happened in both Sri Lanka and in India. And we certainly saw it play out at its worst in both these places during the pandemic, when both these communities were blamed for some reason for the spread of the virus. As much as we know that Asian Americans in the US got blamed because Trump called it China virus. Over here, it was, as you said, Corona jihad and such like. So the political messaging that comes from the leadership also transforms itself into how the public views it. But that said, I will also flag the other. Populist leaders are not always the best cannot deliver the best governance. So they make very big promises. You see, they pretend that they know governance better than anyone else. And, as soon as they're in office, they're going to solve poverty, they're going to solve corruption, they're going to deliver services. And people actually vote them for that. They don't really, hate is a byproduct, which is attractive up to a point. But as we are seeing in Sri Lanka, when it's come down to the fact that you failed in governance, that poor decisions have ended up bringing you to a place where people are out on the street saying, where is my meal? Yeah. Then populism doesn't cut it any more than in India. And in India, you're seeing now thousands and thousands of people, possibly all BJP voters, who are now out on the street saying, what kind of decision have you made that is going to impact my livelihood? So eventually governance has to come, and that, so the hate, the using of social media for hate might be useful up to a point. And the last thing I want to say is, as soon as the message turns, as soon as social media and these platforms are not attractive to promote their messaging, but is instead promoting the legitimate criticism of their policies, you will find there's a crackdown. Suddenly internet is cut. Suddenly WhatsApp groups are being challenged. Suddenly everyone's phone is being confiscated to say, how are you planning your protest? So it changes. So I wanted to flag that as well.
No, I think you draw a very nuanced picture. Meenakshi, I am informed also by what I read about contemporary Russia, where what Mr. Putin is doing, as bizarre as it may sound to listeners who don't know and have read the same as what I have, I think this is familiar to you and I. It is not communicated within the country in terms of any anti-war opposition. And worse, there are stories that the POWs in Ukraine have been imploring their parents, once they're captured, they're free of having to carry Mr. Putin's propaganda, and they've been imploring their parents to help stop the war.
Right.
And you know what? The parents refuse to recognize that. They cannot. You have a society that cannot deal with an alternative to what they have constructed as a consequence of decades of disinformation. And I kind of see that, in Sri Lanka, which I'm very familiar with, we had the extraordinary Aragalaya. Aragalaya means, revolution or struggle in Sinhalese, the Go Home Gota uprising. And it was, unlike anything the country's ever seen. And we can have a conversation about that later. But, one of the things that happened with social media is it was a bloom and blossom and spread of content opposed to the Rajapaksas in a way that literally the country's never seen before.
Right.
Now, what's happened today, though, is that as the Aragalaya recedes and the existential crisis of just how to get through the day has come to the fore, now you see again the disinformation of the Rajapaksas, by the Rajapaksas, and for the Rajapaksas taking center stage again. And again, you see this frustration around people who cannot question the reason for why the country is in the mess today, and are going back to, that savior mentality, that same populist discourse. So my question in that context, Meenakshi, is that I am increasingly of the opinion that disinformation really is a societal virus that it stunts society. It really stunts one's ability to, even when presented with an alternative that is critical of the reason why you're going hungry, for God's sakes, they still can't grasp it. Would you say that that is something that you feel or see or agree with? And if not, why not?
So, yes, the disinformation is a massive challenge, because obviously in an ideal world, I'm actually all for a maximalist freedom of expression. But that challenge is now a challenge because of where the platforms, because the platforms are driven by algorithms, are driven by what makes footprints and such like. So it isn't a sort of soapbox debate any longer. And therefore, you're right, because what happens therefore is that the disinformation is spread faster. I often speak of my parents in that regard, because they're older generation who would say, oh, this has come out in the newspaper. The newspapers are saying this. It was at that point of time, that big thing that the papers have reported something. And now they tend to treat that same, the platforms as news source in the same way. So they believe it to be the truth. So therefore, disinformation is an interesting thing, because it isn't, people believe that to be the truth. The Russian parent believes that Putin is doing the right thing. And you were an idiot to have gotten caught and stop complaining because we are man. That's because that is the narrative that is being fed to them, that they do believe. But there is a counter to this, because often you will find that states are actually the most vociferous when it comes to countering, to saying that there must be, legislation to counter disinformation. That's why I said that I was a bit concerned about this freedom of expression thing, because then it becomes subjective. What is disinformation? Who's wrong? And we've seen that, I'm afraid, in the biased way that the Indian state, for instance, has treated protests. Pro-government protests, Hindus are not being, despite the massive amounts of hate and vitriol that they spread, are not punished. Other activists, Muslims, their messaging is almost always immediately, or you're disrupting communal harmony, you're causing religious hurt, that narrative comes in. So, if the state is the arbiter to decide, then we are always going to end up on the wrong end, because they will only want to promote their own views.
And it's a tough one, isn't it? Because here in New Zealand now, after my doctoral research, I'm dealing with regulation, dealing with, in turn, containing, curtailing and controlling the seed and spread of harms online. And it's an interesting discussion here in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. But what I always try to say is that because we're all part of the Commonwealth, that countries like India and governments like mine will always adapt and adopt the language to stifle FOE, freedom of expression. And so that's the hard thing. I mean, with Section 230 or with the stuff that's coming out of the United Kingdom now, or the new regulations on disinfo from the European Union.
Yes.
I think that our government, or even like from across Malaysia and Singapore, which the Rajapaksas have been very keen to copy paste from, including POFMA, which out of Singapore is I mean, it's bad enough in Singapore. I mean, it's entrenchment in Sri Lanka will be disastrous for first principles. But that's a conversation that many don't seem to be even aware needs to be had.
Right.
It's because they're not quite aware of the fact that the Indian government, the Sri Lankan government, will be very keen supporters of all of these good sounding things, because they know what they can do in their own countries using that language to stifle political dissent.
Well, here's the funny thing. So India had, the previous government, the Manmohan Singh government, had enacted this law, which had Section 66A, which was a very broad interpretation of freedom of expression and curtailing of it. And it became most famous when some two young women had liked a post by somebody else on Facebook and they were arrested. So, and then it was brought to justice, and eventually, and in fact, the Modi government, when it came in, actually supported the repealing of this section, saying it, because at that point, don't forget, the BJP was most vocal on social media and in their campaign. So they didn't want anyone coming in the way of anything that was described as hurting religious sentiment and such like. Anyway, cut to now, they're bringing 66A back. That's their idea, to sort of comply with the universal efforts to try and contain misinformation. So I'm saying that it's interesting how these things play out. Look, I mean, we know this for a fact in the Sri Lanka context, in our campaign on trying to get rid of the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We know for decades it's been misused. When we speak to governments, they will always say, but in compliance with the counter-terror legislation that the UN adopted, but Sri Lanka absolutely needs a counter-terror law. So, okay, fine, let's try to tweak this PTA. And the tweaking of PTA is not going to get anywhere, but because, we know that it's the intent. The law can exist in whatever form. It's the intent and the poor intent, in which case the law needs to be changed. So therefore, these debates will continue. So I am saying that, yes, misinformation is a problem. Yes, states might need to, with the best will in the world, might want to suggest that there should exist this law. We also know that there isn't the best will in the world. It is almost always self-serving, whether it is the state, whether it is the company, whether it is, an external actor trying to intervene in an internal situation, all of these situations, these things are going to be manipulated. So the end result, I suppose, if you don't want to despair, is at which point will the consumer become better informed?
No, I agree with you. But on that point, I want to kind of segue into something that you passingly mentioned, which is, free speech. And I think that term is now used, or at least most recently used, in the context of the proposed acquisition of Twitter by Mr. Elon Musk. And not a single presentation that, or article, or video, or thing that he has put out, or even the most recent leaked video of the all hands on deck conversation that he had with the company, I think a week ago from the point of recording this, gives me any confidence that he has an understanding of platform governance and oversight and the matters that he's talking about beyond a very simplistic, basic understanding. And the problem, though, is now that he is going to be the owner of a company that has a huge footprint in your country and mine. And if you come to the table with free speech as he has defined it, are you concerned around what that will mean in the context of what you just said are domestic regulations and legislations and regulatory frameworks and governments that are more interested in curtailing political dissent, that might play in very well with what Mr. Musk says is only speech that transgresses a certain legal definition that will be taken off the platform?
Well, yeah, as I said, in a maximalist world, sure, that makes kind of, that would be great, but we know that there is the reality. So yeah, I mean, to be the populist of a corporate world, to be that make that kind of promise, then comes with the sort of healthy dose of, again, governance requirements. Because there are one of the things that we know that intermediaries are facing are the challenges of their staff security. So, when Amazon is told that, one of your shows has offended somebody or the other, it is the Amazon executive that is facing those cases. At which point parent companies have to start sort of wondering about self-censorship or other kind of censoring. So those are the realities that almost every populist endeavor deals with. It's the same thing as saying, I'm going to give you 50,000 jobs, but then people say, but the fine print is only for 4 years, and then we have trains being burnt in India, or we'll have fertilizer that is organic and we're going to be this perfect world, and oops, there is no rice. So these are all great ideas that might, when not informed and not based on enough consultation, and I suppose comes from earnestness. The intent is very earnest and problem solving, and I'm going to get this done. And then you kind of say, grapple with the facts, and oops. So we are witnessing various kinds of oops already around the world, and here possibly will be another one that will be an oops and then some correction.
I want to step back though, and we are dealing with platforms that are now inextricably entwined in our DNA. Everything from marriage and love and sex to religion and politics, is seeded and spread and engaged with and morphs and merges and transforms the way we think of ourselves, our lives, our families, our communities, but they aren't from us. They're not of us, and they're not made for us either. Where do you see, Meenakshi, this all heading towards? I mean, are we meaning South Asia, are we always going to be an appendage, an afterthought to the discourse on Section 230 or across the Atlantic on the online safety bill, or, further afield with the European Union's disinformation thing? Are we always going to be called into the room as opposed to be front and center in the room? Given, you know what I'm saying? Like, we are what props up these companies, but it doesn't seem to be the case that whatever discussion or discourse there is, I think necessarily to kind of reform and regulate these companies, have us in mind.
Well, it's a broader context, right? I mean, and I suppose it sort of leads up to something that you said earlier about our work. So what is human rights work, and why is it that quite often we are being told, when people talk about human rights, so interfering in the sovereignty of our nation or the integrity of our nation, or, so it's because almost all of them this is process that is Western driven. It's viewed as Western driven. So our South Asian governments, and often is the governments in the room when these negotiations take place. So we have to speak to our governments, to our elected leaders. So then we have to say that why are elected leaders always on the defensive? Why are they not taking leadership roles? Because that is true. Right now, apart from China, the group of South Asian leaders would possibly be representing the biggest block of consumers for these platforms. For these.
No, China doesn't come into the equation because the platforms don't operate in China. Yeah, so they're not there.
So apart from China, the next lot of people is South Asia, this subcontinent. Now, if this subcontinent cannot get its act together to be present in that room and is always being defensive, then there will not be leadership. So we don't have the leaders we deserve. That is also the case. Our leaders are almost always being a little bit of the turtle. As soon as they're attacked, they sort of curl into it themselves, and they don't want to be the one that steps forward. Because if they did, to go back to various parables, they might even win, right? Remember the hare and the tortoise, they might even win. But they don't. We don't have that leadership. We don't have the progressive leadership. We have leadership that is so self-serving that they're only looking at their own domestic next election campaign. They possibly are not driven by any kind of public good in the taking the long view, and we don't have that. So if we don't have that, we're also ran, aren't we?
What the irony is, though, that Microsoft, Google, Twitter, till Musk acquires the company, they're all Indians heading the company. I might be missing out on several other Silicon Valley companies as well.
They are Indian origin. They're not Indian.
In the case of Twitter, I think he
was Indian.
I don't know. It does. You would think that, I don't know. In my naivete, I would think that there is some sort of, as I said, my naivete. But I would think that there was some sort of interest in addressing, even, you keep saying profit, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there's academic research out now that suggests that what really helps shift the needle on internal structural reform is not you and I. It's a bad media cycle, right? So if only to avoid a bad media cycle, you would think that these people would look at South Asia a bit more. But they don't seem to be doing that.
Well, I'm a little bit sort of afraid of the token diversity arguments that many enterprises seem to embrace, because token diversity in itself means that if you rise to a particular position, you are in fact still driven by the objectives of that particular enterprise, and often possibly put to bigger test in some ways. It's a bit unfair to believe that someone of Indian origin or an Indian who has risen to a high post will then get a different view, because they will be driven by the need to succeed. And the reason I say this is because, don't forget, in South Asia, we've had a number of, across South Asia, we've had women leaders, whether it's Buttu or Sheikh Hasina or Chandrika or Indira. We've South Asians have produced great women political leaders. Not one decided that they had to cater to women's rights. We never saw that happen. So therefore, at that point, I suppose they become subject to the job requirements of whatever those might be. So as much as these leaders did not speak to the rights of South Asian women in any way or contribute in any way, I don't see why people, South Asians who are rising to high jobs are going to be focused. I would like them to, because that is the diversity argument. But I also know from our own experience, that doesn't really occur. Once they get to that chair, then they're led by the chair.
I mean, just recent reportage about the Facebook's shenanigans in India would speak to your point. I don't want to get into that because I think there's been a lot of media reportage, but, I wanted to get to it tangentially, kind of also at the end of our podcast. The WHO coined the term infodemic, and we may use it or not. We may call it information disorders or the longevity and the enduring nature of information, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. I think that not unlike how some people are saying that we will have to learn to live with COVID-19, though it means very different things. There's a great deal of violence in the offhandish statement that some make, that we need to learn to live with COVID-19, but for the purposes of the argument, let's say that we do. I think there's a parallel in digital landscapes as well, where we will need to learn to live with and deal with disinformation. And just like the biological virus, it is going to mean very different things to very different people in different countries and communities and cultures and contexts. With regards to what HRW does, knowing what you do and doing what you do, what are the implications of the long shadow of the infodemic, exacerbated and amplified by the pandemic, on South Asia, but also more, just more generally as well, on human rights per se, on first principles, on UDHR, and on all of this? Is it bleak, always destined to be at the margins of whatever that we talked about, nominally on a particular day, on Human Rights Day celebrated, but for the other 364 days not really recognized? Are there new things that you think are going to be challenges, around the endemicity of information disorders? Or, as you've kind of throughout this podcast drawn a very nuanced landscape around the simultaneous interplay of help and harm? Do you see some potentials as well?
We do see potentials. Look, the thing is, one of the things that has happened is that nothing remains very secret anymore. If we spoke about China, even from China, we are getting information now. So what has happened is that bad actors also need to at some point start fearing, because nothing remains secret, which is the good thing. And then, of course, there is that sort of anguished misinformation claims that bad actors make. So we see that already. So when we see that already, we do know that there is a certain level of leaks of and which would not have happened earlier. The populace that would like to live in a dark room and issue edicts and have people, their citizens, completely fall in line with their edicts no longer occurs, because people start talking and things come about. So therefore, that is perhaps our biggest tool as well on human rights. It is the fact that there aren't that many secrets. Our next challenge, of course, is to make people believe in rights again. And that's the problem, because I think and this is partly perhaps pandemic is going to do more to it, is that we've become very siloed. We've become very internal looking. However much we might be connected through technology to people, in individual interactions, we've become much less. And therefore, we don't care. You see, unless we know that our neighbor is being thrown out of their house unfairly, we will not care about that neighbor, because it's all, in the ether somewhere. And then we can boil in our little bit of hate with great satisfaction, because we are not out there. So therefore, that I don't know how it will change, but perhaps we will need to start talking a lot more and finding new language about rights. Where are we headed in the end? Incitement to violence has always been our biggest red line. Incitement to hate and therefore violence has been our biggest challenge, right? Because that is what these messages have done. They've brought people out and started, what in India is called lynching, but that kind of thing, right?
Well, in Sri Lanka too, actually. Sri Lanka too.
Yeah. So, which is a weird term, but but it's become sort of South Asian and everyone says lynching. But it is, it's basically mob that feels enabled to come out and kill somebody. And, some get punished, some don't get punished. But the fact that the act even occurs, that you are able to sort of engage in that level of brutality is something that is incited and fanned, is where our challenge lies. And as much as any self-serving political establishment or structure or narrative might enjoy that when it's serving them, it changes. You see, everyone, it's like democracy. At some point, things change, things shift. And therefore, we have to take the long view of this. But before we end, I'm still going to say that while social movements and rights and public discourse and political structures happen in their own grammar, there is on the other side companies that are driven by profit. And the accountability that they need to embrace is a different one. Because if you're going to be so smart that you're going to put your product in the hands of 3 or 4 billion people, then you're smart enough also to create the math that is going to prevent hate. It's just that you're not investing in it. You're not putting the resources to it. And therefore that accountability, that is on you. So I'm not absolving them, is what I'm saying.
No, listeners won't obviously be tuned into my facial responses or yours for that matter. But I gave a look of incredulity because what shred or modicum of evidence can we think of to hold up that argument of yours, Meenakshi, in the decade. Over the decade of it's actually in recent biographies of Mr. Zuckerberg, right? I mean, the greatest levels of harm in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and in India, or the foundations for what we see today, happened at a time when the company called it growth hacking, right? I mean, they were only interested in accelerating the market capture.
Oh yes, I've met Facebook executives who have blatantly told me so. So no, there is no question of. But that said, look, we every company at some point pretends that it does good, right? I mean, there is a sort of the tip of hat towards CSR,
the veneer of it, yeah.
So who knows? I mean, but it is for us. If they are driven by profit, then we as the consumer have to start demanding more or find other businesses, right?
What the irony is, though, that you and I both, and all activists, all human rights organizations, United Nations, and governments also. I mean, the interesting thing about the hashtag, delete Facebook, that crops up every time that there's a whistleblower from the West who says X company has done this, or has resulted in hate, hurt, and harm, and violence and death. The West's response is to get away from that platform.
Yeah.
And it's farcical for those of us from South Asia. And it does occur to me that we use the platforms that contribute to the harm for our work as well. It's ironical, isn't it? We can't do without these platforms, and I suppose there's some way forward in that regard that is a bit more nuanced than the Manichaean worldviews. The deplatforming versus the black and white that kind of dominates the discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look. It depends, and that's what I'm saying. That right now, for me, for Facebook, for instance, I'm still on Facebook, but it's a bit of a digital contactless. I mean, I don't, for instance, I have your email, but it's much easier for me to find you on Facebook and text you, right? I mean, because I know you're right there, and I don't have to worry about contact and phone number.
Yeah.
That's they're a glorified digital diary for me. So fine, others. So it's not where I go for information or anything. But yes, I do understand that a lot of our clients, a lot of the communities we serve are on those platforms, and therefore we have to use those platforms to service those communities. That's true. That's our job. But in terms of personal choice, that is my choice. So therefore, I'm saying that people will start making those choices.
Eventually. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, just on the point of Facebook, though, please don't contact me on Facebook. I don't check it often. My doctoral research was a curious thing. I looked, as very hard around the role, reach, and relevance of Facebook and Twitter on Sri Lanka's violent outbreaks and constitutional crises. And as a consequence, I got thoroughly disgusted with Facebook. So I'm still on it because I can't get away from it. Right. Because as you said, it's useful it's integral to the work that I do, but, I don't put anything personal on it anymore. So, these are strange worlds that we inhabit, I suppose. But very interesting, Meenakshi, as ever. Thank you for drawing a nuanced picture of our region, which is something that is so often sorely missing from the debates that at least I am connected to and engaged with on some of these issues. Thanks again for taking the time during your sabbatical, and good luck with everything in your country, mine, and South Asia.
Yeah, thank you. I consider all of South Asia mine, and I'm always seeking good vibes. We deserve better than we have. Right
we absolutely. What a fantastic note to end this on. Thanks, Meenakshi.
Thank you.